Judge Judy's courtroom was a pressure cooker of emotions. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made your skin prickle and your heart race. Every seat was filled, reporters with their notepads poised, activists clutching signs, and curious onlookers leaning forward in their chairs. The hum of whispered conversations buzzed like a swarm of bees, punctuated by the occasional click of a camera shutter or the sharp tap of a lawyer's heel against the polished floor. At the center of it all sat Judge Judy, a figure of unshakable authority. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her black robe seemed to amplify her presence. Her sharp eyes, like twin blades, scanned the room, missing nothing. She had seen it all in her decades on the bench, the liars, the victims, the broken systems. But this case was different. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that had failed too many for too long. The case of Officer Richard had become a lightning rod for national outrage. A white police officer accused of racial profiling after wrongfully arresting Angela Carter. A black federal prosecutor was the kind of story that dominated headlines and divided dinner table conversations. Social media was ablaze with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Angela. Hashtag Fire Richard. Hashtag End Racial Profiling. The courtroom was a microcosm of the larger debate raging across the country. Judge Judy raised her gavel, and the room fell silent so abruptly it was as if someone had hit a mute button. The sharp crack of wood against wood echoed like a gunshot, commanding attention. "This court is now in session," she declared, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. It was a voice that brooked no argument, no interruption. She leaned forward, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Officer Richard, who sat stiffly at the defense table. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority, now seemed to weigh heavily on him. His lawyer, Greg Harper, sat beside him, his polished demeanor doing little to mask the nervous energy radiating from his client. "Let me summarize the facts of this case," Judge Judy began, her tone measured but laced with an undercurrent of steel. Officer Richard, while on duty, pulled over Angela Carter, a federal prosecutor, for allegedly resisting arrest. Despite Ms. Carter presenting her federal badge and identifying herself as a law enforcement officer, she was handcuffed, detained, and subjected to racial slurs. This incident was captured on dashcam footage and witnessed by multiple bystanders. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the reporters, usually quick to scribble notes, sat frozen, pens hovering above paper. Judge Judy turned her full attention to Richard, her eyes narrowing. "Officer Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that was almost conversational, but no less intimidating. "I want to hear how you thought arresting a federal prosecutor was the right thing to do." The room erupted in murmurs, but a single glare from Judy silenced them. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing a deep red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His lawyer, Harper, quickly interjected. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," Judy snapped, cutting him off. "I asked Officer Richard a question, and I expect him to answer it." Richard cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, I believed I was acting in the line of duty. Ms. Carter was uncooperative, and I felt it necessary to detain her for further questioning." Judge Judy's eyebrows shot up, her expression a mix of disbelief and disdain. "Uncooperative?" "She showed you her badge. She identified herself as a federal prosecutor. What part of that screams uncooperative to you?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Judy leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving him. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. "This court will not tolerate excuses. If you cannot justify your actions, then you have no business wearing that badge." The tension in the room was palpable. Angela, seated at the plaintiff's table, clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She had spent weeks replaying that night in her head, the flashing lights, the cold metal of the handcuffs, the sting of Richard's words. Seeing him squirm under Judge Judy's scrutiny brought her a small measure of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been targeted because of the color of their skin. In the gallery, a young black man named Marcus, who had been stopped by Richard months earlier under similar circumstances, clenched his teeth. He had come to the trial hoping to see accountability, but he wasn't holding his breath. "They always find a way to let them off," he muttered to the woman beside him, who nodded in grim agreement. Judge Judy's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of reckoning. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning, a moment that would define not only the lives of those in the courtroom, but also the broader conversation about race, power, and justice in America. As Richard struggled to find his words, Judy leaned forward again, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "Let's get one thing straight. Officer Richard, this isn't just about you. It's about every person who has ever been wronged by someone in a position of power, and I intend to make sure justice is served." The room erupted into whispers once more, but Judy's gavel came down again, silencing them. "Proceed," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The trial had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom fell silent as Angela Carter rose from her seat and walked to the witness stand. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step echoing like a drumbeat. She was the picture of composure, back straight, chin lifted, hands steady as she placed them on the wooden railing. But her eyes, dark and piercing, burned with a quiet fury that spoke volumes. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, replaying the incident in her mind, steeling herself to relive it in front of strangers. The bailiff handed her a Bible, and she placed her left hand on it, raising her right. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" he intoned. "I do," Angela replied, her voice clear and unwavering. She sat down, smoothing her skirt, and turned her gaze to the prosecuting attorney, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Daniel Hayes. He gave her a reassuring nod before beginning his questioning. "Ms. Carter," Hayes began, his tone gentle but firm, "can you please tell the court what happened on the night of October 12th? Angela took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I was on my way to a crime scene," she began, her voice steady. "I was driving through the downtown area when I noticed flashing lights behind me. I pulled over, assuming it was a routine traffic stop." She paused, her jaw tightening as she recalled the details. "Officer Richard approached my car and asked for my license and registration. I handed them over, along with my federal badge. I identified myself as a federal prosecutor and explained that I was on official business." Hayes nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And how did Officer Richard respond?" Angela's eyes flicked to Richard, who sat at the defense table, his face impassive but his hands clenched into fists. "He ignored my badge," she said, her voice hardening. "He told me to step out of the car. I asked why, and he said I was being uncooperative. Before I could respond, he opened my door, grabbed my arm, and pulled me out." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Judge Judy's sharp glare silenced them. Angela continued, her voice rising slightly. "He handcuffed me, in front of everyone. People were watching, recording on their phones. I kept telling him who I was, but he wouldn't listen. He called me names, racial slurs. He said I didn't belong in a car like mine, in a neighborhood like that." Her voice cracked, just for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I've never felt so humiliated, so powerless. I'm a federal prosecutor. I've dedicated my life to upholding the law, and yet, in that moment, I was just another black woman being treated like a criminal." Hayes turned to the jury, his expression grave. "Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence." He handed a USB drive to the bailiff, who plugged it into the courtroom's AV system. The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, showing dashcam footage from Richard's patrol car. The video played in silence, the images speaking for themselves. Richard's aggressive demeanor was unmistakable, his raised voice, his rough handling of Angela, his dismissive gestures as she tried to explain herself. The footage ended with Angela being led to the patrol car in handcuffs, her face a mask of anger and humiliation. Hayes then called his first witness, Carlos Martinez, a young Latino man who had been driving nearby that night. Carlos took the stand, his nervousness evident as he adjusted his tie. "I saw everything," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Officer Richard was intense. He didn't even look at the other drivers. He went straight to her. It didn't feel right. When it was his turn, Greg Harper, Richard's lawyer, approached the stand with the confidence of a man used to winning. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone smooth, "you admit that you were in a hurry that night, correct?" "I was on my way to a crime scene," Angela replied evenly. "And in your haste, is it possible that you were less than cooperative with Officer Richard?" Angela's eyes narrowed. "I showed him my badge. I identified myself. That's more than cooperative." Harper smiled. A practiced, disarming smile. "Of course. But Officer Richard was under a great deal of pressure that night. He was responding to multiple calls, dealing with a high-crime area. Isn't it possible that this was simply a misunderstanding?" Before Angela could respond, Judge Judy interjected. "Mr. Harper, are you suggesting that arresting a federal prosecutor is a reasonable response to stress?" Harper hesitated, caught off guard. "Your Honor, I'm merely pointing out that Officer Richard is a dedicated public servant who made an unfortunate mistake." Judge Judy raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "A mistake? Arresting a federal prosecutor is like saying you accidentally threw a rock through your neighbor's window. It doesn't just happen." The courtroom erupted in laughter, but Judy's gavel quickly restored order. "Move along, Mr. Harper." Judge Judy leaned forward, her sharp eyes locked on Richard like a hawk sizing up its prey. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Richard shifted uncomfortably in the witness stand, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and glanced at his lawyer, Greg Harper, who gave him a tight nod of encouragement. But no amount of coaching could prepare him for Judge Judy's relentless questioning. "Officer Richard," she began, her voice calm but razor-sharp, "let's start with the basics. Why did you ignore Miss Carter's badge?" Richard cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Your Honor, I didn't ignore it. I thought she might be impersonating an officer. It's not uncommon for—" "Impersonating an officer?" Judy interrupted, her eyebrow arching in disbelief. "A federal prosecutor? With a badge, credentials, and a government-issued vehicle? Do you often encounter federal prosecutors impersonating themselves?" "Officer Richard?" The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter, but Judy's gavel silenced it instantly. Richard's face flushed red, and he stammered. I mean, I was just being cautious. It's part of my training too." "Your training?" Judy cut in again, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Teaches you to handcuff a federal prosecutor after she's identified herself? Is that standard procedure?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His lawyer, Harper, stood up quickly. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," Judy snapped, her gaze never leaving Richard. "I'm asking the questions here. Officer Richard, answer the question. Why did you ignore her badge?" Richard's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. I didn't think it was real," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Speak up," Judy commanded, her voice like a whip crack. "The court needs to hear you." Richard swallowed hard. "I didn't think it was real," he repeated, louder this time. "I thought she might have faked it." Judy leaned back in her chair, her expression a mix of disbelief and disdain. "You thought a black woman in an expensive car must be a criminal. Is that what you're saying?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. Finally, he exhaled sharply and admitted, I saw a black woman in an expensive car, and I assumed she didn't belong there." The admission hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, and Angela, seated at the plaintiff's table, shook her head in disgust. Her fists clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She had known it all along. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing him admit to the bias that had stripped her of her dignity, was both vindicating and infuriating. In the gallery, a young black woman named Tasha, who had come to support Angela, whispered to her friend, "He actually said it. He actually admitted it." Her friend nodded, her eyes wide with shock. Judge Judy's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She leaned forward again, her voice low but carrying the weight of a judge's authority. "So, your bias led you to violate her rights. Is that correct?" Richard hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't mean to." "Yes or no?" "Officer Richard." Judy interrupted, her tone leaving no room for evasion. "Did your bias lead you to violate her rights?" Richard's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Judy's scrutiny. "Yes," he whispered. "Louder." Judy demanded. "Yes," Richard said, his voice trembling but audible. "My bias led me to violate her rights." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled to jot down quotes. Activists in the gallery exchanged triumphant glances, and Angela's legal team shared a quiet nod of satisfaction. Richard's lawyer, Harper, buried his face in his hands, knowing the case was slipping through his fingers. Judge Judy let the noise continue for a moment before slamming her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" she barked, her voice cutting through the din. The room fell silent, but the tension remained, thick and electric. Judy turned to Richard, her expression unyielding. "Officer Richard, your admission today is not just a confession of your actions. It's an indictment of a system that allows bias to flourish unchecked. This court will not tolerate such behavior, and neither should society." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Your bias didn't just harm Ms. Carter. It undermined the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. And for that, there must be consequences." As Richard stepped down from the stand, his face pale and his shoulders slumped, the weight of his admission hung heavy in the air. Angela watched him go, her anger tempered by a flicker of pity. He was a product of a broken system, but that didn't excuse his actions. If anything, it made the need for accountability even more urgent. Judge Judy's words echoed in her mind. Your bias led you to violate her rights. It was a truth Angela had known all along, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so definitively, felt like a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by prejudice. The trial wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and for the first time in weeks, Angela allowed herself to hope that justice might finally be served. Daniel Hayes, the prosecuting attorney, rose from his seat and approached the jury, his presence commanding the room. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of the trial settle over the courtroom before he began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This case isn't just about Angela Carter. It's about every person of color who has ever been targeted, humiliated, and stripped of their dignity simply because of the color of their skin. It's about every individual who has been made to feel like they don't belong in their own community, in their own country." He turned and pointed at Richard, who sat stiffly at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. Officer Richard's actions were not a mistake. They were a betrayal of the trust we place in law enforcement to protect and serve all citizens equally. He saw a black woman in an expensive car and assumed she was a criminal. He ignored her badge, her credentials, and her humanity, and in doing so, he violated not only her rights, but also the principles this country was founded on. Hayes walked back to the plaintiff's table, placing a hand on Angela's shoulder. "Angela Carter is a federal prosecutor. She has dedicated her life to upholding the law, and yet, in that moment, she was reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of Officer Richard. That is not justice. That is not equality. That is not the America we strive to be." He turned back to the jury, his voice rising with passion. "You have the power to send a message today, a message that bias and prejudice have no place in law enforcement, a message that no one is above the law. I urge you to hold Officer Richard accountable for his actions and to stand with Angela Carter, and with every person who has ever been wronged by the system. Greg Harper, Richard's lawyer, stood next, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to Hayes' fiery passion. He approached the jury with a calm, almost apologetic air, his hands clasped in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured, "Officer Richard has served this community for over a decade. He has put his life on the line to protect the people of this city. Yes, he made a mistake, a grave one, but let us not forget that he is human. He was under immense pressure that night, dealing with a high-crime area and the stress of his job. He acted in the heat of the moment, and for that, he is deeply remorseful." Harper paused, his gaze sweeping over the jury. This case is not about excusing his actions. It's about giving him a chance to learn from them. Officer Richard is not a bad person. He is a dedicated public servant who made an error in judgment. He deserves the opportunity to grow, to change, and to continue serving this community. He stepped closer to the jury box, his voice softening. "I ask you to consider the man behind the badge. Consider his years of service, his commitment to his job, and his willingness to take responsibility for his actions. Punishment should not be about destruction. It should be about redemption. Please, give Officer Richard the chance to make amends." The courtroom was silent as Judge Judy took her seat, her expression unreadable. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the papers in front of her, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Finally, she raised her head and addressed the court. "Officer Richard," she began, her voice firm and unwavering, "you have failed in your duty to protect and serve. Your actions on the night of October 12th were not only a violation of Angela Carter's rights, but also a stain on the integrity of law enforcement. You allowed your bias to cloud your judgment, and in doing so, you betrayed the trust this community placed in you." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "This court has heard your admission of guilt. You saw a black woman in an expensive car and assumed she didn't belong there. That assumption led you to disregard her credentials, her position, and her humanity. That is not a mistake. It is a failure of character." Judge Judy's voice grew sharper, her words cutting through the room like a blade. "Justice has no room for prejudice. If you cannot tell right from wrong, then your badge is meaningless. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you are hereby dismissed from the force, required to undergo racial sensitivity training, and fined $50,000. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Judy's gavel silenced them. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "Let this be a lesson to you, and to all who wear the badge. The power you hold is not a license to discriminate. It is a responsibility to uphold the law for everyone." As the verdict was read, Angela sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a much larger war. Richard's dismissal wouldn't erase the pain of that night, but it was a step toward accountability, a step toward justice. Richard sat slumped in his chair, his once proud posture now collapsed under the weight of the verdict. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. The badge he had worn for over a decade, the symbol of his identity, his purpose, his pride, was gone, stripped away in an instant. He stared at the empty space on his chest where it used to rest, his fingers twitching as if reaching for something that was no longer there. The courtroom buzzed around him, but Richard heard none of it. His mind was a whirlwind of regret, shame, and disbelief. He had spent years building his career, earning the respect of his peers, and convincing himself he was one of the good guys. But now, as the reality of the verdict sank in, he was forced to confront the truth. He had become the very thing he swore to protect people from. His thoughts drifted to Angela, her composure on the stand, the fire in her eyes as she recounted the humiliation he had inflicted on her. He had tried to convince himself it was a mistake, a moment of poor judgment, but deep down, he knew better. It wasn't just about Angela. It was about every person of color he had ever stopped, questioned, or dismissed because of his own biases. The weight of that realization was crushing. As he stood to leave the courtroom, a reporter shoved a microphone in his face. "Officer Richard, do you have any comment on the verdict?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He pushed past the crowd, his head down, and disappeared into the cold, gray afternoon. Weeks later, Angela stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium, her presence commanding the room. She had been invited to speak at a community event on racial justice, and the crowd hung on her every word. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a system that allows bias to flourish and excuses it as human error. But let me be clear, there is no excuse for racism. There is no excuse for violating someone's rights. And there is no excuse for silence in the face of injustice." The audience erupted in applause, but Angela wasn't finished. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. It's about every child who grows up fearing the very people who are supposed to protect them. And it's about every officer who thinks their badge gives them the right to judge, to discriminate, to dehumanize." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But it's also about hope. Hope that we can change. Hope that we can hold people accountable. And hope that we can build a future where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." As she stepped away from the podium, the crowd rose to their feet, their cheers echoing through the auditorium. Angela felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of responsibility. She had become a symbol, a voice for those who had been silenced, and she wasn't going to stop fighting. Meanwhile, Richard sat in a small, dimly lit classroom, surrounded by a dozen other officers who had been ordered to attend racial sensitivity training. The instructor, a soft-spoken but firm woman named Dr. Evelyn Carter, was leading a discussion on implicit bias. "Bias isn't just about what we say or do," she explained. "It's about what we don't say, what we don't do. It's about the assumptions we make without even realizing it. And until we confront those assumptions, we can't begin to change." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to admit that he had a problem. But as the training went on, he found himself recalling moments from his career, moments he had brushed off or justified at the time. The black teenager he had stopped for looking suspicious. The case of Angela Carter versus Officer Richard became a landmark moment in the fight against racial injustice. It was more than just a trial. It was a catalyst for change. Angela's courage in standing up to systemic bias and Judge Judy's unwavering commitment to justice inspired countless others to hold power accountable. The message was clear and unyielding. No one is above the law. News outlets dubbed it the trial that shook the nation. Documentaries were made. Books were written. And Angela's name became synonymous with resilience and justice. Her story was taught in schools, discussed in community forums, and held up as a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced by prejudice. The case forced a reckoning within law enforcement and beyond, sparking a nationwide conversation about race, power, and accountability. Years later, Angela Carter sat in her own courtroom, her black robe a symbol of the justice she had fought so hard to uphold. She had become a judge, known for her fairness, compassion, and unshakable integrity. Her journey from federal prosecutor to judge was not an easy one, but it was fueled by her unwavering belief in the power of the law to create change. One day, as she presided over a case involving a young black man wrongly accused of a crime, she felt a familiar surge of determination. She looked at the defendant, saw the fear in his eyes, and remembered her own experience. "This court will not tolerate injustice," she declared, her voice firm but kind. "We are here to seek the truth, and the truth will prevail." Her rulings were often cited as examples of how the legal system could and should work. She became a mentor to young lawyers, especially women of color, encouraging them to fight for what was right, even when the odds were against them. "The law is only as strong as those who uphold it," she often said. Never forget that. The Latino man he had handcuffed for resisting arrest. The Asian woman he had questioned for not belonging in a wealthy neighborhood. For the first time, he saw those moments for what they were, not mistakes, but manifestations of his own prejudice. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, a fair cop, but now, he wasn't so sure. The case sparked heated debates across the country, in living rooms, on social media, and in the halls of Congress. People argued over what the verdict meant for law enforcement and society as a whole. Some praised Judge Judy's decision as a long overdue step toward accountability. "This is what justice looks like," one activist tweeted, alongside a photo of Angela speaking at the community event. "No one is above the law." Others defended Richard, framing him as a victim of cancel culture. "He made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to lose his career." A conservative commentator argued on a popular news show, "This is about politics, not justice." Protests erupted in several cities, with demonstrators demanding systemic change in law enforcement. "Fire racist cops," they chanted, their signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Angela" and "End police brutality." Counter-protesters clashed with them, shouting, "Back the blue," and "All lives matter." The nation was divided. But one thing was clear: the conversation about race, power, and justice was far from over. In the midst of the chaos, there were small signs of progress. Police departments in several cities announced new training programs on implicit bias and de-escalation. Legislators introduced bills aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement. And communities came together to have difficult but necessary conversations about race and privilege. For Angela, it was a start. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew that change was possible. As she looked out at the crowd during her speech, she saw not just anger and pain, but also hope for a better future, a fairer system, and a more just society. And for Richard, it was a wake-up call. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to confront his biases and take responsibility for his actions. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. Richard, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild his life. The fallout from the trial had cost him his career, his reputation, and many of his friends, but it had also forced him to confront the person he had become, a man who had let bias cloud his judgment and betray his duty. He began attending workshops on racial sensitivity and implicit bias, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. Slowly, painfully, he started to unpack the prejudices he had carried for years. It wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, denial, and shame. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when he realized how much harm his actions had caused. Eventually, Richard began speaking at community events, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. "I was wrong," he would say, his voice heavy with regret. "I let my biases dictate my actions, and I hurt people because of it. I can't change the past, but I can try to make sure others don't make the same mistakes." His speeches were met with mixed reactions. Some applauded his honesty and willingness to change. Others dismissed him as a hypocrite, a man trying to rewrite his legacy. But Richard didn't speak for praise or forgiveness. He spoke because he believed it was the right thing to do. Judge Judy's words from the trial, "Justice has no room for prejudice," became a rallying cry for activists, lawyers, and everyday citizens. Her bold stance against systemic bias inspired a new generation of judges to prioritize fairness and equality in their rulings. She retired a few years after the trial, but her impact on the legal system was undeniable. In her retirement, Judy wrote a memoir, reflecting on her career and the cases that had shaped her. She dedicated an entire chapter to Angela's case, calling it one of the most important of her career. "The law is not perfect," she wrote, "but it is our best tool for creating a more just society. It is up to us to wield it wisely." The ripple effects of the case were felt far and wide. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs on implicit bias and de-escalation. Body cameras became standard issue, and accountability measures were strengthened. Communities began holding regular forums to discuss race and policing, fostering dialogue and understanding. Protests still erupted from time to time, but they were met with more empathy and less resistance. The conversation about racial justice had shifted, and while there was still much work to be done, there was also a growing sense of hope. Years after the trial, Angela, Richard, and Judge Judy found themselves in the same room once again. It was a symposium on justice and equality, and each had been invited to speak. As they stood on the stage together, the audience fell silent, captivated by the symbolism of the moment. Angela spoke first, her voice steady and strong. "Justice is not a destination," she said. "It's a journey, and it's a journey we must take together." Richard followed, his voice quieter but no less sincere. "I've learned that change starts with acknowledging our mistakes. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Finally, Judge Judy stepped forward, her presence as commanding as ever. "Justice has no room for prejudice," she said, her words echoing through the room. "But it has endless room for growth, for compassion, and for hope. Let us never stop striving for a better tomorrow." The audience rose to their feet, their applause a testament to the power of their message. It was a moment of unity, of reflection, and of possibility. A moment that reminded everyone in the room that change was not only possible but inevitable.